All right, we are looking at the Civil War, and last unit we looked at some of the things, the events that led up to it, and we're going to do a quick review of that. We're only going to go back into the 1850s. The Civil War will be fought from 1861 until 1865, 4 years. So back in the 1850s, 1852, you have the book Uncle Tom's Cabin that really depicts slavery in a very negative light to the Northerners. The Southerners feel it's a crude representation of what life was like in the South. It stirs the emotions. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, passed by the federal legislation that said that any new state that came into existence would be voted on by popular sovereignty. That territory, those states themselves would vote on whether or not they wanted to have uh, slaves in their state. This was changed from the Missouri Compromise that said no, anything below the 36th parallel would be slave, anything above would be free. We have Bleeding Kansas, which is the lead up to the vote to decide whether or not Kansas and Nebraska would be slave or free states, and the both sides, the abolitionists and the slave states, shedding blood and killing, and that again, this is all drethering up anger and frustration. In 1858, you had the Dred Scott decision, where Mr. Chief Justice Taney rules that slaves can never be citizens and can never really be free, and that slave owners can move their slaves into slave-free states. You then have the John Brown raids in 1859, and so tension is extremely high leading up to the Republican, or excuse me, leading up to the presidential election of 1860. And in 1860, there's going to be, as we saw in that video, 4 political parties that will have a candidate on some or all of the ballots. The Republican Party was headed up by Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln had defeated a gentleman by the name of Seward. Seward was uh, the heavy favorite, but Lincoln was able to defeat him for the Republican nomination. And then there was the Democratic Party that was split in two. You had the Southern Democrats, who were opposed to the Northern abolitionists, and they were slave states. And then you had the Northern Democratic delegates, and they were headed up by Stephen Douglas, and they were pro-slavery, but they were willing to compromise in some areas. They were hoping Douglas would get elected, and then they could keep their way of life in place. And then you had the Constitutional Party. Abraham Lincoln will, there we go. Always do that. Ultimately, the South is got a feeling that their life and their way of life is being threatened. They're being told that they're this backwards group of people and that they're not allowed to live the way they want to live down in the South. The Northerners feel like, hey, you can't do this. It's just wrong to enslave someone based off the color of their skin. The South feels like they can't trust the North, that the North are constantly going back on their word. We have a Supreme Court decision. We have a legislative branch. Remember, the legislative branch makes laws. We have the legislative branch in the Kansas-Nebraska Act that says we'll leave it up to the individual states. We have a Supreme Court decision that says, no, it's going to be this way. And now you have a Republican candidate that's saying, no, we're not going to have any slaves in any of the new territories. So they just feel like they can't trust Mr. Lincoln, even though Lincoln makes it clear in his inauguration, in his platform, that he's not going to do away with slavery. They just don't trust them. So after Abraham Lincoln is elected in November of 1860, and back then you didn't get sworn in until March of the next year, South Carolina and 6 southern states will secede from the Union. Now, this is before Lincoln will take office. So these 6 states are South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. The acting president, James Buchanan, does nothing. Most perceive James Buchanan as either the worst president or in the top 3 of the worst presidents ever in our history of our country. So Lincoln's walking into something where he's going to have to make a decision. Is he going to let these guys go, or is he going to force them to come back in? Immediately, you'll have a lot of the forts that are in the southern territories. The federal government will say, you need to seize those forts. Now, in addition to the 6 that left, we had 4 more states that will decide. These are called border states. And border states are the definition of a border state is a slave-owning state that decides not to secede from the Union, like the other 7 did, excuse me. And those 4 are Missouri, Delaware, Kentucky, and Maryland. Now, Virginia chooses to secede later on here in a little bit, but the northern part of Virginia says, no, we're not going to secede. So the northern part will break off, and then they will eventually become their own state called West Virginia. So there are 5 total slave states that chose to stay in the Union. And those are, again, Missouri, Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and which will now become West Virginia. After these guys secede and Lincoln's coming in, and the federal government has been told to take the forts and that within the southern territories, tensions are high, conflicts are going to come. Before we get into that, though, I do want to take a moment. We have talked a little bit about this, about the advancement of weapons in the Civil War. And, we have taken warfare and accelerated the ability to kill greatly since we had been fighting in skirmishes in the 1830s with Indians and the War of 1812, and then skirmishes with Indians after that. When we get to 1860, we're not real sure what we have on hand. The rifles are much more accurate. They're much quicker to load. You can load and fire with it up to 10 times a minute. They will fire much farther. You can fire up to 500 yards now with these rifles. So though they are still technically a musket, you could fire up to about 50, maybe 75 with the old musket of the Revolutionary War. You're now firing 5 times that. With this musket. The bullet that you're using, the head of the bullet is now made of lead. When it hits, it will expand. So your entry wound is small, your exit wound is larger. Killing power is much greater. And when you shoot it, it doesn't just go to the air blindly. It actually spirals just like a football will, so it goes much farther. In the Civil War, we started to see for the very first time landmines and a very rudimental hand grenade, and these are going to increase the range of killing. So I'm on the battlefield and I throw I light the fuse on this hand grenade and I throw it to a group of guys that are hiding out over a group of trees. I can kill them now. It's filled with shrapnel and I can kill them. We didn't have that before. In addition to that, we have large artillery / cannons, and cannons become much more accurate, much lighter. They're made where you can move them around. They're considerably lighter than the other ones. The cannonballs go from being solid and round to being hollow inside, where you will have a casing around and then you'll have broken shards of metal, and they'll call that shrapnel. And so when it explodes, all those that casing will explode, and all those shell fragments, little metal pieces, will be sprung out, and they will rip and tear flesh. This is all going to increase the killing power of artillery. In the Navy, warships are predominantly, you had a lot of, early on in the war, you had some wooden ships. but they're sunk because iron ships and steel ships can handle a cannonball much better than wooden ships can. And steam-powered ships are much more effective and much faster than the sail. So the real advancement in the Civil War is with these ironclad ships, what they're called, that are covered. They might be wood, but they're covered in steel or iron plaid over the top of them, and they're steam powered. Again, these are much more effective, and they kill at a much better rate. So all this adds up to a war where we're going to not only have both sides be committed to their cause, but you're going to have new weaponry that's going to make killing a lot more potent than what we had seen in the past. This is going to be true in World War I. It's going to be true again in World War II. And I think today we haven't seen a major war on a large scale to see what the weaponry we've had. I remember back when Operation Desert Storm came into existence, and we absolutely decimated a standing army that stood in one place. Saddam Hussein's forces were wiped out. We killed well over 100,000 troops really in about an hour. And we have that kind of killing power. And I don't think a lot of people know that. So let's take a look at the major battles in the timeline of the Civil War. The very first battle was at Fort Sumter, which is in South Carolina. Again, I was talking about the federal troops. Lincoln is brought into office in March, and they're trying to decide what they're going to do. And are they really going to fire upon Southern Americans? And the Southerners are having to decide, are we really going to fire on Northern Americans? And finally, the South and the president of the South, the Confederates, by the name of Mr. Davis, will decide he will take Fort Sumter back, and he fires upon Fort Sumter. And after a several week delay, the Union forces will surrender, and that's the first major battle, and that takes place in April of 1861. The next one is in July of 1861, and this is called the Battle of the First Bull Run. It's fought in Virginia, and a much larger Union force was soundly defeated by the Southern smaller force. And I think the Union realized this isn't going to be a quick, decisive victory. Well, this may take a little longer than we thought, and in fact, it's going to take quite a bit longer. Even though you have a lot more resources, the South is determined and they have great leadership. The Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862. Now, there's a whole bunch of battles that are fought in between these. I'm just bringing up these because they have significance. In the Battle of Shiloh in 1862, that was fought in Tennessee, and this is the first clear victory for the North. In this two-day battle, 23,000 men from both sides will be injured or killed. That's a bunch of people. The War on Terror has taken 6,000 lives in 18 years. In one day, there was 23,000 casualties. So that's the first victory for the North. By and large, the North in the first 2 years of the war are getting beat. In most altercations, they're getting beat by smaller number of men of the South. Next, we have the Battle of Antietam, and Antietam is it's the bloodiest battle, one-day battle in the history of the United States military forces. That should tell you how many people died at the thing. It was fought in Maryland in a very, very small area. The Union claims victory, but I don't know. It's most experts said it was a stalemate. I remember my class in college, and my professor, who I always valued as one of the most brilliant guys I ever listened to, he said it's a stalemate. Both sides take heavy, heavy casualties. As I mentioned, 23,000 men will die in just one day. In literally 2 hours, almost 20,000 guys will die. But after the war, or after the battle, President Lincoln, who was very fearful the entire time he has been saying this is about preserving the Union, will now jump up and make the famous Emancipation Proclamation speech, that he gives to the world and to anyone that will listen, that this is about freeing the slaves. It's a wonderful speech. It's a fantastic speech. The problem is Mr. Lincoln is not in a position to free the slaves in the South because they're underneath the control of the Confederate Army. And he doesn't want to upset the border states and have them secede, so he really doesn't have any force behind this speech. But it's done more for other countries outside to say, hey, we're fighting against the tyranny of slavery. And if you support the South, you're supporting slavery. And it's stopped every country in Europe from supporting the South. Next, you have the Second Battle of Bull Run, again, fought in Virginia, and this one will be fought a little over a year later in 1862. It's, again, a victory for the South. They're outnumbered heavily by the North, but General Lee will stop the North, and the North is very indecisive, and they're defeated. And this is a big win for the South and General Lee. A little over a year later, the largest battle of the war, the Battle of Gettysburg, the one we're watching the movie on right now, is a three-day war or three-day battle where you're going to have two forces, one of 90,000, one of 70,000 meet up, and you're going to have a whole bunch of people die. And the Union will win the battle. The South, I mean, you can see the casualties right there, 23,000 dead or wounded in 3 days, 28,000 dead or wounded for the Confederates. That's a third of their army, and both sides will limp away, but the battle is won by the Union. Yep. And the next one, there's a couple other battles that are significant in there, but the Battle of Appomattox is in Virginia again, and it's a battle where the South is completely depleted. Lee's army is got nothing to eat. They're literally starving to death. His troops are. Most of them are ill-clothed. Their health is terrible. Diphtheria. They are ill prepared. They have no more ammunition, and they are finally going to get some trains to come in and to resupply Lee's forces. And Sheridan, the lead general, finds out about it, and they intercept this train. A guy by the name of George Custer, who will come to know we've talked about in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. George is very effective and will either blow up or seize all these boxcars of supplies, and then they will have a skirmish, a battle with the South, and defeat the South. And finally, after this, Lee has got nothing. And the next day, on April 9th of 1865, General Lee will surrender to the Union forces and General Ulysses S. Grant, and that will end the war. It's kind of a quick one, but that's the major battles in the timeline of the Civil War.